What classic fantasy should you read that isn't Lord of the Rings? Everyone's heard of Lord of the Rings, many people have read it, and if you're looking to get into classic fantasy, of course you read Lord of the Rings, but what else is there out there? I'm going to offer 15 suggestions. Let's do some definitions. Fantasy, speculative fiction about imaginary worlds, even if it's our world, urban fantasy. There's trolls who live in the sewers below New York. It's a fantasy where magic is real, supernature is close and comprehensible, yeah, things don't have to work like they do in our world. I'm going to exclude science fantasies. That's things like Dragon Riders of Pern or John Carter of Mars, Sword and Planet stuff. I'm going to exclude horror. Horror is chiefly real horror fiction is chiefly actually sci-fi, in terms of it is about, here's this stuff that really is in our universe. It's a sort of very soft sci-fi. It's a science fantasy, really, usually, but it is that. Ghost stories are included. Ghost stories and horror are distinct genres. They cross over in interesting places like The Exorcist, the film, but they are distinct genres, and ghost stories are about the liminality of the world and the nearness of supernature, and the morality of supernature, and of humanity in that context. So yeah, that's fantasy. I haven't read all classic fantasy, and the one that came to mind when I was thinking, what am I going to have to miss out, is Wizard of Earthsea. When I was 10 or 9, I read the first one. I don't remember much about it. I didn't hate it. I'm going to read the whole thing this year, but I haven't read it now, so I can't recommend it. I also just won't recommend some stuff that's quite famous that I don't like as much, and I'm not doing this based on, is it important historically? Read these 15 books to understand all other fantasy. This is somewhat in that area, but it's more, these are good books that you will enjoy, I think, and they help, they'll help you see fantasy as a whole, but it's not a kind of strict history course. With all that said, classic, finally, classic. I usually say classic is 40 years old or more. It's 2 reading generations. You've had recency bias, you've had the kind of the awards wars, you've had often a book disappear for a while, then it comes back, and the worthwhile books come back. There are books now winning major awards, getting lots of YouTube attention over the last 5 years, 10 years, whatever, that will be forgotten in 10 years and will never come back, or 20 years and will never come back. Classics are those that survive that process. I'm actually going to slightly cheat and have it be, by my own standards, and have it be 34 years. So anything up before 1990, basically. This allows me to have a book from 1989. Also, there's a book from 1984 on this list. But we're talking long enough ago that, half my viewers, that's how old they are probably, and it's classic enough. All these boundaries about exact genre and exact age are porous. But you can see the logic behind them. Let's start anyway. Let's start with some sword and sorcery. This is no particular order, not chronological, not importance, but just how they're stacked near me. Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. There are 7 books in this. The first 4 are collected in First Book of Lankhmar, the second 3 in Second Book of Lankhmar. And I would recommend, read the whole series. I have a video on why you should read Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. But if you want to read one, I would actually say read Swords in the Mist, because it both has individual sub-stories and there is a plot that connects all the stories in the book, because these are all fix-ups, basically. Whereas Swords Against Death, which is very popular and is one of the better ones. I mean, 6 of the 7 are very well rated. But Swords Against Death is much more episodic, and I think if you want to have something that's more like just a novel, go for Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser are heroes, sort of. They're mostly good. They're sort of roguish thieves. They adventure in a slightly ruthless world. They are funny. There's lots of very good action in these books, and they have a really great friendship. And I think it's both important as a developmental point for Dungeons and Dragons and for Discworld, as another example. Lankhmar, the city that's the centre of the world, basically in No One, is an obvious inspiration for Ankh-Morpork. So yeah, I would certainly recommend Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. Similar note, just because they're stacked next to each other, Conan the Barbarian. Again, there's lots of Conan to read. I would avoid the continuations that were originally published after his death, usually garbled by L. Sprague de Camp. I would read the originals, including unfinished originals. Choose that over a fixed up finished version by de Camp. If you're reading, you want a novel, he only wrote one Conan novel, that's Hour of the Dragon, which is a collation really of all the other themes. Like you have Conan as a king, you have Conan as a warrior, you have Conan as a thief and an adventurer. And these are different things the short stories do individually. Hour of the Dragon is very good. There is a Howard-esque pace. There's a way that Howard paces fiction, which very few authors come close to doing really the same thing as. There's one other person on this list I'll say is often similar, but Leiber and other similar authors don't really go so far as that, and some imitators like Moorcock aren't very good at it. He just communicates a story, a scene in, a whole scene with lots of stuff going on in basically a page of text or 2 pages of text, and that's consistently what he does. So there's constantly a moving on. Conan is a force of nature. There are kind of interesting philosophical questions raised by Conan. The pathos is not around Conan. He's not a sympathetic character. That's not what he's there to be. But there is a way in which you see civilized, decent people caught between forces of nature. And the most famous of those is probably the best Conan story, Beyond the Black River. I'd also recommend, I've done a reading of this, so you can go and listen to it if you like, Tower of the Elephant. And that's a good one probably. And Red Nails. Those 3, Tower of the Elephant, Red Nails, and Beyond the Black River, are probably a very good summary of what Conan's about in the short story or novella format. Hour of the Dragon is a whole summary of everything Conan's about, really, in a novel format. Norse saga that's a bit depressing. Paul Anderson, The Broken Sword. I should say, Leiber is 1930s to 1990s, pretty much. I think the last very late 30s to very early 90s. Conan is 20s and 30s in terms of while Howard was alive in publishing. The Broken Sword by Paul Anderson is 1954 originally, and it is a Norse saga about a human child kidnapped and raised by elves and the changeling put in his place. And it is a massive sweeping saga. Anderson doesn't quite do the Howard pacing thing, but he is very efficient. Things keep moving. The tone is very different to the Howard pacing, but this is 230 pages and it really is a saga. It really is very complete. In some ways I prefer his other great fantasy epic story, 3 Hearts and 3 Lions. It's better natured, it's more heroic in format, but here the characters are heroes, or particularly Skaflock, our hero, is a hero. He is doomed, and nonetheless struggles in the face of doom. It's interesting, Moorcock loved this book and very much contrasted it to Tolkien, not realising Tolkien had partly translated the Kalevala and had written his own Kalevala in Turin Turambar in the Silmarillion. A Ghost Story, Peace, by Gene Wolfe. This is my Gene Wolfe entry. His most famous fantasy is from the noughties, actually, of all times, Wizard Knight. And some of his other approachable fantasy is around our cut-off point or just after. So Castle View, which I've reviewed on this channel, is early 90s, I think. Castle View, I don't think is one of the 15 best classic fantasy, even if you did count that up to that date, 30 years ago rather than 35 or 40. Peace is the 1970s. It's his 3rd or 4th novel. I think his 3rd. I know 4th. Operation Ares, 5th Head of Cerberus, Devil in the Forest, and Peace. 1975. It is a mystery. It is formulaically, format-wise, obviously a ghost story. Like, knowing what's going on. Like how are these liminal realities mixing and merging? But exactly what's going on is not at all clear, and so when I say its genre is that does not mean that its components are that. It's more complicated than that. Wolfe is a complex author. This is not necessarily the best introduction. It's good introduction to Wolfe for people who like mysteries, who don't mind picking at a mystery as the centerpiece of the book. It's also stylistically one of his most beautiful. It's before he started compressing his style, which leads to a very different effective style. And it's much more transparent than his other stylistically than his other great work of that pre-compression period, i.e. Book of the New Sun. So yeah, it's a sober, serious, thoughtful, challenging book that I think yeah, highlights a lot of the kind of value of the genre that it's in. So I recommend that. Let's think a bit different. We've had some sword and sorcery, we've had the saga, we've had a sort of supernatural story. What about the Princess Bride? This is something in the fairy tale subgenre, and the fairy tale subgenre is adjacent to the fairy subgenre. That's a different thing, but is yeah, and indeed the top review blurb is a wonderful fairy tale from the Times. William Goldman, on what the film was based, is 1974 or something, 1973. This has an introduction, this edition, the 25th anniversary, which is like a mock thing by a fake William Goldman, also writer of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid in my top 10 westerns. But yeah, he talking about the translation process of Morgenstern's book, etc., etc. It's sweet, it's funny, it's exciting. The characters, you know, Fezzik and Inigo Montoya. Hello, you kill my father. Hello, my name's Inigo Montoya. You kill my father. Prepare to die. And the Six-Fingered Man, Prince Humperdinck, Vizzini, the Dread Pirate Roberts, and Buttercup. You know, Buttercup's resisting marriage to a man she doesn't love, while her love has disappeared at sea, slain perhaps by the Dread Pirate Roberts. Rats of unusual size. It's silly, but like the best silly books, it's serious as well. In the sense, it has a real story to tell about people who are identifiable, are resonant. So, as a representative of, call it the fairy tale genre, something alongside things like Stardust by Neil Gaiman, which is itself a bridge between the kind of American fairy tale and the British fairy story. I'd go for that. The Princess Bride. Another slightly odd, this is the most left field one that I've picked, Comet in Moominland by Tove Jansson, a Swedish minority Finn. Published in Swedish in 1945, translated in 1951, about a family of Moomin trolls and their odd friends. We have Snufkin, who's sort of like a human but not quite, and Sniff, who, I mean, yeah, I know looks a bit like a dingo, but is just some weird animal person. They live in a Scandinavian landscape. A comet is getting really close, and they have to move, and everything's a bit crazy. And that, yeah, this is the first mostly prose textbook rather than The Moomins in the Great Flood, which is much higher ratio of illustration. These are whimsical and creative. Actually, the biggest thing why Comet in Moominland is one of my favourites in the series is how picaresque and creative it is. Here's a new thing. Oh, we've got and found this other weird thing. We're forced onto solving this problem. It's adventure fiction in a sort of Don Quixote-esque format, not in terms of the humour, but in terms of the structure. And it's just very fun and sweet. The last couple of books in the series, I think there's 8 in the main pro series, ignoring the kind of kids cartoon books. She was quite depressed and they're a bit weird, and I think she stopped them writing prose. I think she continued with the cartoons for a while, and then they were taken over by her son, maybe. Someone can correct me. But yeah, Comet in Moominland is something very different to most of the rest of this list. How about some Sword and Soul, Imaro? So Sword and Sorcery, but in the subgenre of that, the sub-subgenre of Sword and Soul. Charles Saunders loved Conan, but struggled with the ridiculous ways in which Howard deals with race. You know, there's a black character, he's stupid and evil. That's universal. It's as if I were to read a book where every white character was stupid and evil, or a news cycle where that was the case, and that'd be a terrible experience, obviously. But that was the kind of the tension he felt, and so he thought, why don't I write a story with a hero I can identify with and see, you know, like as in, is someone I don't, you know, I can feel like, oh, that's me. And we can debate representation here, but like, I think it works really well. It's in a fantasy Africa using his ancestral stories, and the action is great, the pacing is fun. Imaro is very different to Conan though, because Conan, the pathos is about the kind of, where there is pathos, sometimes there's no pathos whatsoever, but where there is pathos, it's for those people swept up by the great natural forces of human history. Here, there's no great historical theory working out, and there's no sort of anxiety about civilization. Here, it's just that Imaro is a sympathetic character. He is much more of a protagonist in that sense than Conan. This one, I kind of debated, is this breaking my own rules? Tales of the Dying Earth. The Dying Earth is technically, sort of sci-fi, far future, the sun is dying, etc. And Other Dying Earth, Book of the New Sun, is definitely sci-fi, I think. And this is, of course, the problem, that the genre boundaries are porous, especially for great writers and creative writers who can mix and play with different ideas and sometimes use a bit of sci-fi and sometimes a bit of fantasy. Dragon Rise of Pern, for instance, is definitely sci-fi, but something like Sword of Shannara, even though it's nominally actually a post-apoc fantasy, is definitely fantasy. It's just it's both tropically fantasy and structurally fantasy. The things in it, the ways things work, the way things are presented to you are fantastic. The Book of the New Sun is Dying Earth, but it's sci-fi despite having a fantasy dressing. This Tales of the Dying Earth, I'm going to recommend the Dying Earth, specifically the first collection of stories, is fantasy dressed up with sci-fi elements occasionally. There are ruined cities of the ancients, but and there is some kind of occasional gesture towards, oh, maybe these creatures are aliens we're dealing with or whatever, and there are aliens, but it's very, very little to do with the kind of the sci-fi speculative imagination, and there are plenty of things which seem to more or less pass as magic and supernature, like actual magic and supernature. I would say, because I don't really like Kugel, who is 2 of the 4 books about Kugel the Clever. I don't like Kugel. I don't massively like those books, though they are often interesting or funny. Rialto the Magnificent is more silly and whimsical, better natured than Kugel. That's the Rialto the Marvellous, sorry, the 4th book. But I think is not quite as high quality. The Dying Earth is the first collection and is a fix-up of several stories, which I think is more or less the Dying Earth at its best. I think they're at their most humane and most creative. Vance is there. It's closest to other fantasy of his, like Lyonesse. There's a very good line in terms of thinking, if we use the idea and depiction of image of a dying earth with ruined cities and strange technologies, but also magic, and essentially magic being central there as fundamentally fantastic magic. And then we mix and match these with strange monsters that feel like a kind of part of a decadent earth. I think that gives that's more or less gives the picture. That's kind of why it's fun and inventive. And Vance is constantly inventive, and some of the characters you can really engage with, like Giala Sefer, I think is a good example of a character you can care about. And Vance, that's sometimes a struggle, and sometimes intentionally. Kugel is the anti-hero of the 2 Kugel books, but is an awful evil person. Vance knows this. He's not tricking himself, but I find it easier anyway to engage with characters I actually don't hate. In the very British fairy section, alongside things like Elidor, alongside Jonathan Norell and Mr. Strange, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norell, you've got Mythigo Wood, Robert Holdstock, Vance, that is 50s to 70s, I feel like. This is 1984. This is the first in the Mythigo Wood cycle. I think the second, Lavondus, is probably the best, but I think it's worth starting here. It is very good. And here, Stephen Huxley has already lost his father to the mysteries of Riotwood. On his return from the Second World War, he finds his brother Christopher is also enthralled to the mysterious Wildwood, wherein lies a realm where mythic archetypes grow flesh and blood, where love and beauty haunt your dreams, and in promises of freedom lies the sanctuary of insanity. Here, this is actually also has an even lighter dressing of sci-fi than The Dying Earth. Technically, there might be a scientific reason behind the fact that all these folk stories and myths and legends are bound up in the Wildwood and come to life, and there are that's what a mythico is, you know, these archetypes. But really, it's just a sort of deeply Jungian exploration of the human psyche, of just the way in which these ideas capture hold of us and consume our lives. It's very powerful, striking, expressionistic. You know, these striking scenes, bold uses of colour and angular description, and they're tough novels, not tough to read. I mean, I think Levondis, this is not a criticism, is an amazing bit, but Levondis eventually becomes very dreamlike and strange and hypnotic. Mythico doesn't quite go as far as Levondis does, but there's a similar thing where sometimes you're having to let your pre-conscious just get going on the book. It is, I think, the apogee of the British liminal fantasy. I have another British liminal fantasy, they have a slightly different subtype coming up, but it's I think the apogee of that, and that gives you links all the way back. Obviously, it also touches on Narnia, which I haven't included in this list, I should say. It's kind of like Lord of the Rings, it's a universal. But also back to George MacDonald and The Princess and Curdie, or Dunsany, King of Elfland's Daughter. This grand tradition of the liminal British fantasy, where it's not that, Harry Potter even, it's not that, so the X-Files is the American fairy tale often, like scratch the surface and there's all this weird, crazy, creepy, horror-y stuff. And it's very cinematic and very pulpy. The British liminal fantasy is just, things are weird and sort of hypnotic and disturbing. There's a reason this weird French cartoon, The Magic Roundabout, got translated into English and became somehow weirder when you pick up on it. I think we added our own species of insanity to it. Let's talk about something different. C.S. Lewis, I haven't included the Narniad. The Planets trilogy is space fantasy, science fantasy. Till We Have Faces, though. Psyche is loved by, well, seemingly by Cupid, the god of love. Her older sister, who is perceived as not attractive, Orual, is very jealous, and set into moral crisis by this. But this is Orual's journey, and it is Lewis's last novel, I think. Does it come after 1956? Yeah. So this will come after the last battle is finished, and it is a very sensitive and thoughtful work. It's a deeply probing into human nature. It is, I'm not sure, you know, it's not necessarily Lewis's best work, though it might be. Some people actually would just say it is. I think probably both That Hideous Strength and the Narniad are better. But this is an adult novel, so if you don't like the Narniad, you might prefer this. I think it's very different to other stuff you might have read by Lewis. It is a lot more pensive. It is a lot more, kind of carefully probing. You know, he's always a very perceptive writer, always a very humane writer, but I think this is just something slightly different as he takes an ancient myth of Cupid and Psyche, and he spins it and twists it and pulls it and kind of makes it into a story about the human soul and human development. So C.S. Lewis, Till We Have Faces. I've not got Tolkien, but let's talk about post-Tolkien epic. I've mentioned Shannara. No Shannara, no Sword of Truth, no Wheel of Time, and not even any Thomas Covenant, which is a really interesting set of books, which I do think are probably very good books, and I've respected and enjoyed in a certain value of the word enjoyed, but I literally never recommend it. It's a weird thing. I do recommend The Dark Tower. The first book, The Gunslinger, some people say is not as good as the next few. You should start at book 2. I think The Gunslinger is really good. It is not so much of a novel. It is novellas bound up, and that does affect it. The revised and expanded version does sort some of this, but I think you find here the world is collapsing behind Ronan the Gunslinger as he pursues the man in black, seeking the Dark Tower. It is a great kind of Arthurian Grail quest with a complex and not necessarily very likable hero, but who's nonetheless very heroic and very impressive. And I think the gunslinger doesn't have all the stuff that goes on in the Drawing of the Three and the Wastelands, the stuff which is really the guts of the whole cycle of the 7 books. I actually quite like books 5 and 7. 5 to 7 were written at the same time, a bit later, and are not always liked. The ending is not always enjoyed. It's very controversial. King even engages with that controversy in the very ending of that book. I like it, and I like books 5 and 7. I think book 6 kind of has problems structurally and pacing wise that are very, very serious. But books 2 and 3 are generally seen as the guts of the series. I think nonetheless book 1 is both necessary to meet characters, the strange boy from New York, well, the boy, he's not strange, but who's strangely here from New York in this fantasy land. He's called Jake. It sets up stuff to do with what happens with Jake and Roland's feelings about that situation. It sets up Roland and his quest, and it has some absolutely balletic combat scenes. It's, you know, it's great action at points. It is also, the fantasy western is a genre of its own that's very legitimate and good, and so I'm all for getting more of that into your diet. Let's go for another British. This is another British liminal fantasy, Oversea Under Stone. It's one of my favourite covers from the Dark is Rising sequence. I recommend that. I've got a video on it on the channel. Why you should read the Dark is Rising sequence. The other 4, the Dark is Rising, Green Witch, the Grey King, Silver on the Tree. When the dark comes rising, 6 shall turn it back, 3 from the circle, 3 from the track. On holiday in Cornwall, the Drew children find an ancient map in their great-uncle Mary's attic. They know immediately it's special. It's the start of a quest to find a Grail, a source of great power that could contain or resurrect the age-old forces of evil in the world, and the Drews not the only ones searching for it. This is one of the few books that has ever actually given me anxiety. Like, in the sense I feel anxious about what's going to happen next. That is that recommendation. It is a sign of the great skill of Susan Cooper that she, in middle grade books, technically, like the Moomins, there's no anxiety in those kind of middle grade books that are also appropriate for younger kids. These are less appropriate for younger kids because they are actually quite tense. The children scratch the surface of what's going on. They are dragged into and caught up in something far bigger than themselves, something very serious. And, you know, the famous 5 do that too, and sometimes they have to deal with smugglers or whatever. Here it's apocalyptic and spiritually corrosive, and unless they back off or leave it alone, you know, they are in real danger. And the book feels like that. It touches on the matter of Britain. It touches on Logres. So, like if you want an interesting thing about how the American fairy tale deals with the Arthurian legend versus how the British fairy story deals with the Arthurian legend, this is a good contrast. And I think that's so central to the roots of fantasy, and hence why 3 Hearts and 3 Lions deals with the matter of France, the kind of related cousin, and why Mythigo Wood is dealing with the archetypes of the British legendarium, as these are so central. You know, it's important to That Hideous Strength by Lewis. So yeah, this is one of many approaches to this this archetype in our Western collective unconscious, and it's one that executes it very well in a simple short form, you know, just over 300 pages, and which is, you know, aimed at children, but it's got so much more for it than that as well. David Gemmell, Legend, 1984 maybe, 1983, 1984. Mythigo Wood I think is 82 maybe. These are some of the later ones in what we're talking about here. The Dark is Rising is 60s and 70s. The Dark Tower is 70s till noughties, but the Gunslinger is the 70s. I do think, by the way, I'll say about the Gunslinger, just to hark back slightly to that one, that in terms of post-Tolkien epic, it's interesting that it's virtually all American. It's interesting that and I've named 4 series that are in that kind of subgenre. It's interesting that these responses to Tolkien, and it's not surprising, it's just interesting, how they are so distant from his worldview. And I don't think even Scott Card with Alvin Maker and Sanderson with, say, Stormlight Archive, which is the obvious one, come very close. I think the haunting of America is very different to the haunting of Britain. And yeah, I think that's a relevant thing. That's interesting to look at Mythigo Wood or The Dark is Rising for a slightly younger audience, or we're getting onto this Gemma and the Draenei and so on, which is very influenced by American legends. Is that the central moral crises and imaginative worlds being dealt with are just very different. You know, they're very American. The Dark Tower is not actually Browning's Dark Tower. It is at some level. There's a reason why it ends up sometimes with New York and skyscrapers in the Dark Tower series. Legend, David Gemmell, a British author heavily influenced by the Western, who said if it wasn't for his faith, he would have written amoral Western tales of violence and meaninglessness. Instead writes fantasy Westerns, but you know, highly disguised because they're guys with axes, right? The legend is Druss. The stories of his life are told everywhere. Instead of the wealth and fame he could have claimed, he chose a mountain lair high in the lonely country bordering on the clouds. There the grizzled old warrior keeps company with snow leopards and awaits his old enemy death. The fortress is Dros Delnoch. It is the only route by which an army can pass through the mountains. Protected by 6 outer walls, it was the stronghold of the Draenei Empire. Now it is the last battleground, for all else has fallen before the Nadir hordes, and the only hope rests on the skills of that one old man. This is his first novel. It may be his best. That's not to say that he declines afterwards. Gemmell is incredibly reliable as a writer. Basically everything he writes is worth reading in fantasy terms. But Legend, and in fact his style definitely improves on Legend. His structure probably does in his best novels after Legend. But Legend is a thing apart because it's written in great existential crisis. It's a response to his own cancer. It is inspired by his very heroic, inspiring stepfather, Bill. Druss is Bill. Bill comforting a young David about the vampires in the cupboards and under the beds and so on that were very worrying, and no one else believed were there. Bill said, yes, of course they're there. I know about them. And David said, oh, well, what we're going to do about them? And he says, oh, I've broken their effing necks. Druss is a character who jumps off the page, is so real, so heroic, and who brings us face to face with concerns about aging and death and crisis. There's, Surbitar the monk and his crisis of faith, Rek and Virai, falling in love in the midst of a war, which neither of them are likely to survive. Kesa, deeply traumatized by her past, finding relationship and meaning through a father, the father she hasn't had. The incredibly powerful archetypal stories that are just so worth reading, and so emotive and emotional too, genuinely moving, constantly moving, and constantly involving and engrossing, and so well paced. Penultimately, and this is the 1989 Guards, Terry Pratchett. I think Colour of Magic might qualify for our cut-off if it's 40 years, but I went for this. This is where I recommend people start. Discworld, not equal rights, Weird Sisters, but here. Granny is very definitional for the first half of Discworld, and along with Vimes, the main character in the Guards sub-series, Granny Weatherwax, Sam Vimes are these two big representations of Terry Pratchett on the page, or his attitudes on the page. But I think Vimes is more of an everyman. He is more directly, he's closer to us. And that his stories are urban and civilized, they are to do with a social fabric that looks like most of our lives. It's just closer to us. I think it's also Guards. I'm not sure if it is exactly where things really get going for Discworld, as in, he has gotten going before then. But I think it's fair to say goes Colour of Magic, Light, Fantastic, Equal Rights, Mort, Sorcery, Weird Sisters, which definitely is a big jumping off point, you know, things he's hitting his stride, Pyramids, Guards. I think it's fair to say that Guards is a point at which everything that he does really feels like it comes in focus. Character work, Round Vimes, and the extended watch crew who are trying to deal with this dragon who's appearing in Ankh-Morpork, and that's very inconvenient for some city guardsmen who everyone wishes would just disappear, because thievery after all is legal as long as it's run by the guild. That's one of those things that's very Lankmarian. You know, it's something about down and outs, deadbeats, getting caught up in something bigger than themselves. These characters who are fascinating in a city that's really very vibrant, and amazing humour, and also real philosophy, real thinking. It is a wonderful novel, which I highly recommend. And I think Pratchett, when I say philosophical, by the way, don't read, oh, what did Terry Pratchett think about this, or what's the philosophy in his books? It's so much more complex than people give him credit for. Very, very interesting thinker. Finally, at the limits of fantasy, not the limits in terms of where it becomes sci-fi, but the limits in terms of where it becomes impossible to imagine, The Chronicles of Amber by Roger Zelazny. Very good author. These are actually 5 short books that are basically always bound up. There is a sequel series, the Second Chronicles of Amber. Look at the length. It's 800 pages. It's a Robin Hood book. Just read the whole thing, I would say, because it's one story. The first book is called 9 Princes in Amber. I'll read the blurb. Amber is the one real world, casting infinite reflections of itself, shadow worlds, which can be manipulated by those of royal Amberite blood. But the royal family is torn apart by jealousies and suspicion. The disappearance of the patriarch Oberon has intensified the internal conflict by leaving the throne apparently up for grabs, and amnesia has robbed Corwin, Crown Prince of Amber, of his memory, even the fact that he is rightful heir to the throne. It also touches obliquely on the matter of Britain and Arthur, though less so than some of these others. It's planar. There are many worlds, and the Amberites can go between them. Amber is the true world, true order. The courts of chaos are at the bottom. The first couple of books, you have a lot of this investigation and discovery of what's gone on, and beginning to see the worlds. Books 3 and 4 are the sort of the development of the meta plot and the legendarium, and trying to solve the problem. And then the Courts of Chaos, the final one, is the descent, the conflict, the confrontation. It's dreamlike and psychedelic, but not in the way that Mythico Wood is. It's more, reality is actually breaking down. This is the limits of reality. It's very imaginative, it's very fun, it's very conceptually high. Corwin, and indeed his siblings, his brothers and sisters, the other Amberites, are fascinating characters, brilliant characters. Corwin is a really interesting character who we get the classic cheat. He's amnesiac to start with. We soon find out there's more going on about him than you get in the first page. You know, within a few pages, more and more is being set up. And you find out about him and who he was before his amnesia, who he's becoming after his amnesia, which is just wonderful. He's a great character. I have reviewed this on the channel. I've reviewed most of these books at some point. So yeah, I recommend this. I think this is a good place to end, as it's at the limits of fantasy. It's a exploration of where fantasy can get to and how far it can stretch our imaginations. If you've got other classic recommendations, you know, by whatever definition you want to use, please put them in the comments. Say why you think they're a good pick for people who want to read older fantasy that has stood the test of time. I think talk about historically important fantasy as well, because I think, you know, maybe it's not the best book you've ever read, but it's important. That's good to talk about too. Finally, I will probably do one of these about sci-fi. Classic sci-fi is a different thing. There's plenty of classic sci-fi that's really interesting and historically important that reads less well, actually. This is a weird habit of it, weird feature about it. But there is also some classic sci-fi which has aged incredibly well. So I'll probably do one of those eventually too. So maybe drop your classic sci-fi ideas too, if that's your genre. And I'll see you next time.